Hi guys, in this video I'll cover structs in C++, and I go through the steps. Why do we use structs? Then I show how to define a struct. Then I create an instance of a struct, and finally I demonstrate how to access the member variables of a struct. Now, why do we use structs? The example that I'm going to use here is using a point. So a point is represented by x and y, and let's say our program has to manage points. So we create here a point. I mentioned it's x and y. I just pick an integer type, and I arbitrarily pick some values, 3 and 7 in this case. So this is represented by a point. Now I can use that point anywhere in my program. I could pass two variables to a function that needs to access the point. But what happens if I have multiple points? So if I have point 2 and more, I could do x2, x3, x4, and so on, right? I have all the x coordinates of each point, and then I could have the y coordinates, y2, y3, y4, and so on. Or I could even represent that into arrays if need be. But the issue here is that these are logically related, each pair, but there's nothing in the program that encapsulates them and tightly builds a logical relationship between these. So it's not really well managed. Now, this is where structs come into play. So structs is a custom data type that I can create. And here in this example, I could create a struct for point, and then I have a single instance in my class. This is just two variables. I have a single variable. And you could imagine this if you have a coordinate system. Maybe you represent points that are in a three-dimensional space. You have x, y, z. Each point might have a color, so there's additional member variables. If we were to define that with primitive data types, each point would have, I don't know, 5 or more variables. So it will make the program very hard to read and very hard to manage. With a struct, we can encapsulate all these variables into a single point, and then we just manage each individual instance here. So let's go to our second bullet here. Let's define a struct that represents a point. We start out by using the struct keyword. Then we give the struct a name. In this case, I call it point. And then we have a body in which we define the member variables. At the end, it's important to end the body with a semicolon. So don't forget to write the semicolon. And then anything that belongs to the struct will define inside the code block here. So I mentioned I want to represent just a very simple point with x and y. So I define an x variable and I define a y variable. It's important to mention that this struct is not an individual point. So I wouldn't represent the point here with 3 and 7. What I'm doing here is really defining a definition, what any point, how any point is represented, right? So it's really just a blueprint of all the points that my program can handle. And what I'm doing here is essentially saying I have a data type, I call it point, and any point in my program always has x and y, and it doesn't have anything else. So now this completes my struct definition. Now I can go on in my program here and I create an instance. And I do this similar like I do with other variables, right? I always have a data type followed by an identifier. And here the data type is now my point. So this is the data type, and let's say I call this P1. Or I could even spell it out, point. So I could give any identifier that I want to, just like any other variable. Now, point is the data type. And when I want to access the individual member variables, in this case x and y, I do point dot And now you can see these two member variables come up, x and y. So I do .x, and this gives me access to my x. Now, if I want to represent the same point that I conceptually created up here, I do assign 3 to x, and then I do point dot y, and I assign this to 7. So now I represent the same point that I had here up here, just with primitive data types. And now if I would want to pass this point to a function, I only pass the point variable in. I don't have to pass in each individual member variables, right? And you can imagine if there are additional member variables, it would get much more complex. So this is very simple with using a struct. And how can I read these values? So let's output them. The point is at, and I do point.x, and the y coordinate is point.y. Now if I run this, we would get the output. The point is at 3 and 7. So nothing really changes in the way that we handle the variables. The only thing is that we say for our point, for our struct instance, dot, and then we access the member variables. And we can treat them just like any regular variable. The way we read them, the way we update them, the way we assign them, nothing really changes. It's only that we have point dot x before. And this really helps us to encapsulate multiple member variables that logically belong together. A struct, I want to mention before I close out this video, that a struct, we can also define functions in this block and accessibility levels, so we can do much more. But in general, a struct is really good for just defining a collection of member variables that logically belong together. And then for anything more complex, we should use classes. So thank you for watching.